All right. Hi, everyone. How are you? If you haven't already, please mute your line so that we can keep the background noise to a minimum. So thanks for joining us at our very first virtual AI brief. We tried the virtual town hall, went fairly well, and we thought this would be a very good opportunity to restart the AI briefs, even though we are spread out all over the world a little bit still. So as everybody knows, the bank has pivoted quite quickly to support our members and clients through the COVID-19 pandemic. And this has required a lot of quick decision making. And underpinning a lot of that decision making is the analysis that's done by the economics unit, whether that is for projects or just understanding the macroeconomic situation that is impacting us. So today we are going to be joined by, everyone knows, JP, who is going to walk you through some of the analysis that his team has been doing over the last few months to support the bank through the pandemic. As I put in the chat group, if you do have questions, we're going to use the chat function. So feel free to send your chats at any point. So use chat to send your questions at any point. You can send it to everyone, or you can also select to send them directly to me. And then I will share them broadly with the group once we are at the Q&A session. So with that, let me pass it over to JP. You're still on mute over there if you are trying to talk.
Sorry, colleagues, very good afternoon, wherever you are. I haven't seen some of you guys for 3 months. Miss you very much and hope we get to see each other fairly soon. With me, Martin, he does a lot of macro work and debt sustainability. Xingyu on my right, a statistician, and Jingyu is covering the Chinese economy. So there will be some parts that will be about China. Over the last couple of weeks, the econs team has pivoted quite quickly, like Laurel said, to supporting internal analysis for management and also supporting communications team to keep up with the cadence of analytical work that we can be shown publicly in order to support the bank's policy positions. So we didn't get a chance to actually update many members in the bank beyond management. There wasn't an opportunity to do so, and things were moving very, very fast. So I thank Laurel very much for actually organizing this. I think it's a chance for us to all catch up and to hear from you, to get ideas from you, and to share our views. I would like to say that these materials are at presently what you're going to see are confidential. We deliberately sanitize some of our materials we put online in order to make sure that sensitivities are respected. Internally, we can be a little bit more open in the discussion where we see vulnerabilities and stresses, but keep the discussions within the bank and do not circulate this deck of slides beyond this group. All right, so with these ground rules, with the permission, I will start with my briefing. It is going to be a long brief, so there will be several parts. Different people will do different parts of the briefing. I will try to weave in as much as I can in order to make it very, very coherent. Where there are questions and answers, put it in the chat box. We'll be very, very happy to interact with you after the presentations or even online, any discussion groups after that. Thank you very much for your permission. I'm going to begin. So the analysis, the discussion today will start from the very, very short term crisis mode, full screen, into then longer term issues. So I will begin by first talking about the short term, near term events, right? This is the optimistic scenario. All countries will flatten the curve by early second half. On the medical front, some treatment will be found. Lockdowns gradually ease in the second quarter. International travel restrictions ease in the third quarter, and fiscal monetary policy kicks in. The worst is over in third quarter, and we start to recover. Now, many of you would have seen IMF's forecast released last week. When I read carefully the IMF report, I have to say that IMF's report very much mirrors what we think is the optimistic scenario. Deep recession in 2020, particularly in the first half, gradual recovery in the second half, and a rebound in 2021. However, let me bring your attention to the last bullet. Even in the optimistic scenario, the rebound is very uneven. China is going to grow at 9%, while many developed economies will not even recover their present level of GDP output, not even in 2021. So for example, developed economies, -6% this year, only +4% next year. So there may be a lot of implication, not just on our business, but also on East-West relationship. Whatever that happens of post-crisis, we will come to that later. We are on track for what is a mildly optimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario, there are many. Second wave coming, curve not flattened, stimulus not enough, further negative expectations in the market, into successive political and economic crisis. So I will just give a few brief points about that. I do not want to spend too much time on the negative scenario first. We can come to that later in an in-depth discussion. Broadly speaking, the crisis has two rounds of effect. The first round of effect is clear for us to see. It's the shutdown effect, right? So activity declines by 10 to 30%, depending on where you are, depending on which economy, per quarter. As people stay home, business stays shut. The important thing is to prevent the second round effects. The second round effects of demand and supply destruction, many of you have already seen. So all the fiscal and monetary policy must aim at preventing reducing the scarring impact arising from one quarter of economic shutdown. So many of us are already familiar with this train of thought through the news media or through analytical reports that you see. We'll give a lot more color to that in the subsequent slide, but this frames largely the discussion on the short-term economic impact. I will pass now the presentation to Jingyu, who will fill you in with the latest Chinese data that are coming in. I would explain why this Chinese data that came in the past couple of weeks is so important in allowing us to understand the trajectory of the crisis.
Thank you, JP, and thank you, Laura, for organizing this virtual event. So, I would go through several slides divided into two parts. The first part is a brief analysis of the flattening curve of G20 countries during the outbreak. What I did is to look at the COVID-19 confirmed cases, weekly sum in April, and to see which economies are past the peak, approaching the peak, or still seeing rising cases. At the beginning of April, as you can see in this chart, half of the world GDP, which is about 14 G20 economies, we're still seeing rising infections in the beginning on April 1st. And at that moment, a majority of the countries are either approaching the peak or still seeing explosive curve of the confirmed cases. But after 2 weeks or so, as we can see, on April 15, the rising cases, the number of G20 economies with rising cases declined to 13. which was about only 20% of the world GDP, which means that the flattening process was happening relatively quickly. And just a few days ago, when we look at the latest data on April 21st, almost 80% of the world GDP covered by G20 economies have reached the peak of the confirmed coronavirus cases, or even past the peak. So these three lines indicate that over the past month, most of the world economies have flattened the curve. And I would say likely in the next 2 weeks, all of the G20 economies will see a further flattening of the COVID-19 confirmed cases. We also look at the same issue from another perspective, which is the traffic congestion index around the world, in major cities around the world. This data was from April 22nd, which is the level of traffic congestion compared to 2019 average. As you can see, Beijing on the very left have almost recovered 19% of the congestion, and also followed by Cairo and other cities in the world. Still, majority of the cities are still have a low rate of recovery in traffic indicated by the traffic congestion, but we would, as the curve is flattened in the coming weeks or months, this rate is going to increase. Then the second part of my presentation would be heavily focused on China's economy, especially in the first quarter of 2020. As many of you have already seen in media reports last week, that China's GDP in first quarter have declined by 6.8% compared to the first quarter last year. And this decline was largely driven by the decline in the secondary industry, which is pretty much the manufacturing industry, and it declined over about 9.6%. And other industries like services is about it declined by 5.2%, and agriculture declined by 3.2%. These decrease were largely driven by domestic traffic disruptions at the beginning of the outbreak in January to February, and also after these 2 months, the reduced overseas orders in March also contributed to the drop in the production. And from the demand side, we also look at the consumption, investment, and export for the entire first quarter. All of these three components have declined by double-digit percent, according to the data released by the National Bureau of Statistics. And we will see then the second quarter indicators will heavily depend on how the recovery of domestic demand can absorb these negative shocks from global demand starting in late March. And despite the drop in first quarter, we have also seen some signs of recovery and resilience looking at the latest data possible. For example, we have seen since the late February, when the outbreak in China started to be contained, the traffic flow, including air and other types of transportation, started to recover to the pre-crisis level, indicated by the figure 2 in the slides. And also, according to the March data of the PMI index, which is an indicator of the manager's expectation of economic activities in the coming months, it also recovered to the pre-crisis level. And still, we have seen longer disruptions in tourism and entertainment sectors in China. But according to the very latest data last week, even for these sectors, the restrictions are being lifted. And the last issue is about the inflationary pressure that is mentioned by a lot of media reports. But in March, the latest data, we have seen this pressure has been a little bit lessened.
I would just want to highlight one point here about the importance of looking at the Chinese data, right? Like Jingyu mentioned, in the first quarter, the Chinese economy shrank by about 7%, 6.8% to be exact, but let's take it as 7, easy to describe, right? So you guys would know, Chinese economy grow at about 6% on average, right? So it means that in percentage term, it comes up from 6 to 0 and then minus 7. So there is a 13 percentage point decline in second quarter. So if you are the European economy growing at 1%, you probably will see a minus 13, minus 15% kind of contraction per year. So the importance of Chinese data coming in March is to help us actually pinpoint and calibrate, help many modelers, help many economists kind of calibrate the impact of the shutdown. So in that sense, it was really, really useful to track China's data, not just to understand China, but also give a sense as to what is to come for the US and the European economies on the overlapping waves of closures, right? You will have seen that we have put out a paper, a short note to say that China's economy is in fact quite resilient. We didn't want to overplay this point in the note that we put out, but I would like to share with you our when Jingyu tracked the data. So it was quite clear that, at least for me, it was quite clear that the Chinese capital markets, the stock market and the bond markets were very, very resilient, even throughout the pandemic period in January to March. Foreign holdings of Chinese government bonds rose. The yields fell. The yields of China's government bond during the pandemic was even lower than the yields of Chinese government bond during the financial crisis 12 years ago. If you look at the stock market, Chinese stock market also didn't decline as much as what you will observe in the developed economies. So there is a very resilient market, capital market. So in fact, there may be early signs, not definite, early signs that Chinese government bond may even become the second safe haven instrument after UST. We can leave that discussion to longer term issues. Staying on bond issue, you have seen our note last week that quarter one is a record quarter in terms of bond issuance, with $300+ billion of bond issued globally, mostly in China and in US. So corporates did get the cash that they want. Yields rose, but not by much. In fact, infrastructure bond yields rose than the average of the market. Martin is tracking some of the advanced filing, and some of the indicators are that April, you will also see a lot of bond issuance. I'd like to pass the presentation now to Martin. We'll talk a little bit about currency, debt sustainability, and the inflation picture across Asia.
So hello. The corporate debt market is booming. But so let's have a look. Let's have a look at the sovereign debt market. We spoke a lot about China. Let's turn to other parts of the world, to the emerging and developing countries, and to other members of our bank. And this is somewhat a little bit less rosy. It's starting in February 20th. In the 4 weeks following that, as much as $100 billion left emerging markets in one of the largest capital outflows events on records. In terms of speed, this has been nothing comparable to that. In terms of the size, it's comparable only to the Asian financial crisis. And the result was a rise in the cost of borrowing. yields have increased across the board for emerging markets, as you see on the chart. For example, if you're the government of Georgia, overnight your borrowing costs increased from 2% to 8%, and that is in the US dollar terms. And if you're Ghana, then this is an increase from 4 to 13. Clearly, this is not sustainable in the long run and indicates quite a serious macro financial stress. Actually, it has been uneven, and not very surprisingly, the cost of borrowing increased less for countries that had solid macro fundamentals and debts that were lower and more sustainable, and more for countries that have higher debt vulnerabilities, which bring us to the issue of debt sustainability. Okay.
This one.
Oh, this one. Okay. Debt sustainability. Let's keep this. So due to, for example, if you look at Kyrgyzstan, each $10 per barrel is equivalent to 1.4 improvement in current account deficit. So the 35% dollar per barrel decline is almost 5% of GDP for Kyrgyzstan, which is a good news. Yes. Another angle, inflation. Some experts worry that there may be a return to inflation because of lockdowns and supply chain disruptions. There is less supply, less production, less supply, and you would expect higher prices, right? But at the same time, this is also less demand because people are sitting at home and not spending. So which effect is prevailing? The evidence is mixed. It's very country specific, but so far, as we see in the chart, there has not been a generalized increase in inflation or price levels. Back to you.
Sorry to come back to this slide. I still find this slide fascinating because in what is the biggest shock in our lifetime, much bigger than the global financial crisis, actually the currency pressure for developing economies and those in Asia is in fact a lot less. If you compare to the red bars to the gray bars, the red bars is the financial crisis, the gray bars are the pandemic effects. So the gray bars are in general much shorter than the depreciation pressure is much lower. So this is good news, and I think a lot of credit has to be given to the Fed for rolling out so many swap lines and rolling out so many liquidity to ease the pressure on US dollar funding. We have also done some work on medical goods protection in pandemic. Anne, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yep. Will you quickly just say something about this piece of research?
Right. So this picture paints 4 key observations. The first observation is that there's an increasing number of countries that are actually that are imposing export bans. Starting in early March, there were 24 countries which has implemented export bans or some form of export limits. Last check, currently there are actually like 60 countries who are implementing such bans. It's not just developed countries who are implementing such bans, it's also developing countries. Second, there must be some valid reason as to why such countries are doing it. It's because there is an overwhelming global demand shock for medical goods, but then there is actually a limitation on domestic production capacity. Exporting countries who used to export also need to fight their own demons in their own backyards. But then protectionism is a double-edged sword. Countries with the means to produce medical equipment can flatten the curve at the curve faster, but at the expense of non-producing countries. So what is the impact of export bans? Based on our calculations, if 24 countries implemented a total export ban, then half of global goods exports will actually be affected. 70% of AIIB members are expected to be affected by these export bans. Who will be affected? Primarily poorer countries. It's a double whammy for these countries because A, they have poor health systems, and B, they face potential medical goods shortage crisis. The figure on the screen shows that developing countries have significant import needs, while many of these developing country members have fewer cases to date compared to, say, Europe or Iran, it is possible that the lack of medical goods will become a big concern when cases increase further or when the virus hits, especially in, say, Africa. Over to you.
Iram has also done some work on airport projects. So Iram?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. As we're all experiencing, the airport transport sector has been one of the sectors most significantly affected by the pandemic. We are all facing this challenge right now. It had huge impact on the many airlines, and tens of thousands of flights have been canceled and thousands of aircrafts are already grounded. And the airport infrastructure are likely to get the hardest hit as an infrastructure asset class from this crisis. So although some airports have already resumed their construction, we already heard the good news from China. Many of them are expected to be delayed for years. So to better understand the financing needs of the sector, the potential challenges, we listed all the announced airport projects, which accumulated more than 120 billion as of now. And we listed almost 60 projects located all around the world, primarily in Asia Pacific and Europe. And many governments in emerging economies consider airport infrastructure as strategic national assets. So therefore, we mapped all the announced projects based on their sovereign credit ratings. And around 31 out of 60 projects are allocated in the countries that are either rated as a junk or at the risk of slipping into junk status countries. So based on this criteria, we estimated around $20 billion worth of projects that are in the countries with sovereign ratings, and those could face potential financing difficulties in the near future. So of course, this is a rough estimation for the sovereign-backed finance projects. On the other hand, in developed economies, the airports are mostly financed by the private sector. So those investments are more exposed to the credit risk regarding the deterioration in the airport liquidity level and the weaker credit metrics. So during the last couple of months in February and March, many major airports have been already downgraded 1 to 2 notches. Their credit ratings has been downgraded. So this also creates a challenge for the private investors. So to overcome those challenges, many governments have already announced the bailout packages. However, the response is not enough so far. And the vast majority of the airports in developing economies will remain in the public ownership probably. So the deteriorating investment credit ratings and the liquidity shortages will complicate access to finance on these projects. And for the projects that are already started, the financing need is already there. And also for the airport projects that are in the private entities, mostly in developed economies, short-term public support might also be required. And food security. Yeah. So disruptions in transport sector and the protectionist measures as well, as Anne mentioned, regarding the food security is also another important angle that we need to be aware in the near future. Many countries have already announced the export ban on certain agricultural products. We heard it started with Russia and followed by Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Vietnam. So the countries that are heavily dependent on food import will be way more fragile to these changes in commodity prices. For example, for the rice, this we need to be assessed by certain products, but in the rice example, 7 to 8% of the global production is only globally traded, but some certain countries in Africa and Middle East, the total rice import satisfies more than 40% of the domestic demand. So therefore, the restrictions on food trade might have severe impacts on those countries. It's really important to understand the production capacity of the countries in certain products, of course, and how they place in the global supply chain. We have exhibit here to present you. Is actually we already only represented our member countries, but if you look at the countries above x-axis, we see the world's foreign net food exporters, and the ones below x-axis are net food importers. But if you see the countries on the right hand side, upper right hand side, are the ones that are actually really strong production capacity compared to their import demand, and we are expecting them to be more resilient in the near future. Whereas the countries on the bottom left hand side, they are the net food importers. At the same time, their import demand is quite high compared to their production capacity. So collectively, governments should continue to advocate for more open, transparent, and well-functioning global agricultural markets to avoid this crisis. Thanks, JP.
So another important point that I want to link back to is that if you look at food vulnerabilities, and if you look at debt vulnerabilities and you look at other kind of vulnerabilities, unfortunately, you quickly get the impression that the same names are popping up a few times. So there is a specific group of countries, for example, Georgia, Maldives, Oman, that you see they pop up a lot in the various charts, whether it's debt vulnerability or food security and shock to the oil or something like that. So this is an unfortunate part of the crisis, right? There are multiple facets of the crisis, and it seems to be affecting a particular group of countries in many other dimensions. With this slide, we end the immediate crisis part of the presentation. We'll take questions later, but allow me to now move a little bit beyond the crisis. Still related to the crisis, but a little bit more medium term in terms of the discussion. This is one of the earliest charts that we put out publicly to show that the healthcare security is very much correlated with infrastructure quality. I think the logic is quite simple. Without proper infrastructure, without sanitation, without water, without basic electricity, you simply will not have the capability to respond to epidemics. So this is an important kind of a high-level picture that we constantly say. Post-crisis, infrastructure demand will definitely rebound. There will be a lot of demand for basic healthcare, public health infrastructure. And these things are correlated with the ability to manage an outbreak. A lot of you would have heard about the impact of ICT. We all experience this, right? So Jingyi mapped the ICT countries along two dimensions. One is how many people are online. The second dimension on the x-axis is how fast is the online speed. So you can broadly segment the countries into these four groups. So in the top right corner are the least disrupted countries, countries with very high internet penetration and very high access speed. So less disruption, least disrupted. On the bottom right are countries with high speeds but low penetration rate. So very unequally disrupted. So some segments of the population get very good internet, some segments of the population do not. On the top left, equally disrupted, meaning many people online, but poor quality. And then finally, the bottom left corner, poor quality and poor speed. So basically, you can use this to map the kind of ICT need of member countries. And we think that the ICT need post-crisis is also going to be very, very large, in addition to the demands that's already posed by public health. Going forward in the medium term, there are still many, many uncertainties ahead. So these are not forecasts. These are just things and signposts that I think we all need to watch out for. So can we rule out, we have spoken a lot about developing economies debt going up by 6 to 10 percentage point, but advanced economies that are also going up very fast. So Italy, for example, Spain, a lot will depend on policy coordination in EU, whether they are able to give the confidence. So do not rule out, it is very hard to rule out an advanced economy debt crisis at this stage. Think about the monetization of debt, something that I will come back to later in the long run. Watch for stagflation in the middle of supply shock. Marcin mentioned, because of the lack of demand, what you are seeing now is disinflation. So inflation falling to zero or negative, right? But with supply chain disruption, with food and all these things, and with monetization of debt, possibly you can even see an inflation scenario. Not yet the most likely scenario right now, but think about it. In many conversations, podcasts of, if you're listening to the podcast conversation of IMF and all these things, there are increasing calls and acceptance of unconventional monetary or policy measures. For example, capital control, relaxation of macroprudential measure, greater regulatory forbearance, for example, loosening of some loosening of banking standards. And there are also increasing calls for central banks to monetize part of the debt. Thinking ahead, many countries will also have a program. You would have heard, right? Many countries will also have a post-crisis program to use infrastructure development as the way to restart economy. This is not a bad thing, right? So if you have facing a very big recession, using infrastructure to restart the economy as a fiscal stimulus is not a bad thing. But how it is funded, how it is financed, and how it's coordinated becomes very important. Thinking ahead, trade restrictions, and already mentioned about the restrictions in medical goods during this crisis. In the Asian infrastructure report that we just published 2 weeks ago, we also talked about protectionism in the renewable sectors. Some of the IO colleagues will already know the local content requirements and so on. Thinking ahead, we are doing some work on FDI restrictions, particularly in infrastructure sectors. I discussed with some of you about the unflattening of the world during the AIIB Inspire Day in 7 January. That seemed like so long ago. But my own worry is that this COVID-19 will accelerate the unflattening of the world, means destangling of supply chain, more FDI restrictions, more trade restrictions for good and bad reasons. They all come out accelerated by the crisis. Thinking ahead, what does monetization of debt mean? There's high level of debt in developing countries. There's high level of debt in developed economies. I'm not sure any of you noticed. On the 9th of April, the Bank of England announced the direct financing of UK government expenditure, albeit on a temporary basis. In other words, the UK government doesn't have to go to the gilt market to raise bonds for expenditure. It directly gets the finance from the credit that's created by the Bank of England. So direct monetization of debt. So there are many, many scenarios, some more unconventional than others. So this is something that we also need to think about and watch for in the months or years ahead. Some of the scenarios can be really inflationary or can completely change the expectation of inflation going forward. We do not know which is the scenario that will turn out, but we will watch this very carefully. We also have many deck of slides coming out from the specific country development. I'm not going to go through all these things. I'll be happy that if there are any questions to direct at the country team, and our country economists will help follow up to specific country kind of queries. So I think we'll end the formal part of the presentation here. We'll be happy to look at all the questions that, if there are any, and then discuss, have a more interactive discussion with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, JP and your team. Really interesting presentation. Lots and lots of content. We do have a couple of questions that have come in, so I will read them out, JP. So the first one was coming in from Edwin, really appreciating the research that your team has done. I'm curious to hear how you see this fit into AIIB's crisis response facility, and Edwin was specifically speaking to the first part of the presentation. I will speak off record. Kindly not quote me, and this is not a management decision nor a policy. This is a discussion, right? So when I look at this crisis CRF facility, I like to think through the lens of this chart. Give it a while to come out. Right? There are a group of economies who are already in difficulties on an unsustainable path before the crisis. So their vulnerabilities will get even more accentuated during the crisis. I worry if we use CRF facilities
to lend to this group of countries. But there are also a group of countries on the left-hand side that until now are still relatively unscathed by the crisis. So you look at Philippines, right? The yields has hardly changed. The currency of the peso remains very much stable. So these group of countries, they probably will also come in for CRF facilities, but they actually do not actually quite need it. Maybe they are getting diversified funding for insurance, but maybe they also do not need it. I think the sweet spot is for CRF is really to help countries that are facing genuine short-term liquidity problems. So for one country that I can think of is Indonesia. You see a 1%, 2% spike in borrowing costs. But the fundamentals haven't really changed. They are still a fairly prudent government. They are still a fairly responsible finance minister and so on and so forth. The long-term growth potential is still there. It is a temporary 200 basis point spike in the yields that you can help them overcome and also help in the emergency healthcare financing. Ideally, to aim for the middle group using CRF. Ideally, not to do too much for the tough group, right? Because they were already unsustainable before the crisis. But this is just my own opinion. There will be a lot of political economy kind of discussion that will go on at a much higher level. So this is just my own sense. I wonder whether Marcin would like to add to that comment.
I think it's sensible what you said.
Yeah. So the middle group is probably the group that we should try to use our CRF, the 18-month window, to try to help. Okay? Edwin, I hope that answers your question. Laurel, you have to go on mute.
I was muted. Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Very appreciated.
Oh, great. Okay, so Jerminla, sorry I'm mispronouncing the name here. How do we handle trade restrictions and local content requirements?
We can preach. Unfortunately, we are not the authority to manage that part of the policy, right? So while Anne has put out a lot of studies on trade restrictions, not to do it, I think AIIB remains very much on the moral suasion mode. In other words, we show you the studies, but we are actually not the competent authority to manage these kind of international trade disputes, right? So broadly, so long as the policy apply our procurement apply, based on my understanding, I may be wrong on this. As far as the country carries out open procurement system, they can put in local content requirement. There's nothing wrong with that. As far as the procurement policy is concerned, because it is open, just that you need to purchase certain requirements from local. We are trying to show that will actually increase costs of infrastructure if you have too restrictive a domestic procurement or trade restrictive policy. So far, the evidence is still mixed. So, which is why we haven't put out a note to say that there is a direct causation between domestic trade restrictions to higher infrastructure costs. If we find that relationship over time through better data, definitely this is also one of the key messages we will have to put out. So to answer Jermina's questions, we remain on a very much a moral suasion mode, putting out a lot of studies in order to dissuade countries or dissuade a group of countries not to impose this kind of trade restriction policy in infrastructure development. But then if they satisfy our procurement policies, we will still have to finance them and appraise them based on the procurement policy. That is unfortunately the way we have to handle this difficult situation. Another way that we could handle this is to say that the trade restriction has resulted in the infrastructure development being unsustainable economically. Because if the piece of infrastructure development is unsustainable economically, it is something that I think the screening committee or AIIB or investment committee will not want to enter. If the trade restrictions become so severe that it impinge on the economic sustainability of the project. But that will have to be done on a case-by-case, project-by-project basis. It is not a policy basis. It cannot be addressed at the policy level. We are not the policy level, policy competent authority. We have to address it at the project level based on economic sustainability. I hope that answers your question, Jamina.
Thank you. So we're going to move on to the next question from Ji-sun. And so this question is about ICT infrastructure. The question is, if you factored in the sectoral composition of the economy of each country when measuring the disruptions, and specifically curious about those with strong ICT, they tend to depend more on services and have white collar sectors and remote work versus poorer countries that have weak ICT. And they also depend more on agriculture and manufacturing, and where people cannot work remotely.
I mean, that's a good point, right? So if you have a large agricultural sector, ICT is probably not going to be so decisive in the ability to actually cope with the pandemic. It's not so important, right? So Ji-sun, this is something that we will study in greater detail, maybe have another layer to map into those, take agriculture out of the equation and just look at the manufacturing and services sector and see the impact. We didn't show it in this deck of slides. It is something that's being prepared and we probably send to management today. So some of our economists studied the performance of ICT firms in different countries. So in Brazil, South Africa, in China, and in the US. So one of the early conclusions they drew was that ICT companies, e-commerce companies specifically, in developed economies that have good infrastructure did really well in a crisis. E-commerce companies in countries with poor infrastructure, such as South Africa and Brazil, didn't actually do so well through the crisis. So that even among those countries that are non-agriculture, that has an ICT sector, e-commerce sector, there is a differentiation in the performance between those who are supported by very good ground infrastructure or logistics versus those that do not. So this is something, another important point that we will make in the subsequent weeks is that ICT alone is not enough. Basic infrastructure has to be there to facilitate the movement of goods. So we're going to put up this piece quite shortly in the next 1-2 weeks.
Thank you. So next question is from Martine, and she's commenting that when you mentioned the positive impact of lower oil price, the first thing that sprang to her mind was the knock-on effect on climate change initiatives in those countries with sudden access to cheaper fossil fuels. Any thoughts on that?
Alok, are you there? Would you like to come in on the low oil price impact on renewables?
Yes, JB. Sure. So we did some study on the impact of low oil prices on the renewables. So first thing we found was low oil prices. Oil was not a direct competitor to renewable energy because oil prices need to sustain to a very low level for electricity production. The second thing we found out was renewables was more of an agenda-driven concept. So you have the non-nationally determined contributions, and you have country-specific agenda like India's renewable purchase obligations. However, we also found that low oil prices is a good opportunity for oil importing countries to use those savings and channel those to their renewable agenda. So for countries like Nepal, where I'm from, savings on low oil prices, savings on imports can be channeled to financing more renewable projects. There are certain roles for the MDBs that can play, because at this time there are liquidity shortages. Help invest in
there you go.
investment. If I was not clear, I'm sorry. We have a blog post, so I would recommend Martine to read it, and if she has any questions, would be happy to answer that.
Alok is now in Nepal. Nepal belongs to the most disrupted group in the lower left-hand corner of the ICT chart. So beg your pardon for being disrupted during the answer. So coming back to the question, right? So gas prices are linked to oil prices. So one of Alok's findings is that gas prices will come down, and gas will be a large competitor towards coal. So that is in the medium term, it is positive for the climate change agenda, because hopefully the lowering of gas prices will kill coal. But that is only an interim solution, because gas itself is still fossil fuel. So in the long run, we still have to push the renewable agenda. But in the short run, the low oil prices is not a direct competitor to energy generation or renewable. In fact, there is a small element of cost saving, subsidy reduction that can be transferred to renewables, as well as the low gas prices indexed to oil that may put further pressure on coal plants. That is the kind of a logic that we say that low oil prices is not all bad for renewables. Thank you.
Okay, we only have 5 minutes left, so I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to all questions, but the next one is from Calvin, and he's asking if you can unpack a bit more something you said on the success of a post-crisis stimulus will depend on how it is structured and designed. And then specifically, if you think countries should pursue a green stimulus plan, which is what some EU policymakers are saying.
Kevin, thanks for the question. I will answer this, unpack these things. So I am very worried that countries will pursue a nationalistic infrastructure plan post-crisis. That worries me. So everybody will want to kickstart their economy, but everybody will do that for themselves and impose higher trade FDI barriers in the process of restarting their economies through infrastructure stimuli. That worries me. Another thing that worries me, I'm not actually losing a lot of sleep on the second point, but I am kind of thinking a little bit more about it, is that country will just not do proper cost recovery or proper taxation to recover infrastructure costs, and will just do the money printing thing, using central bank to directly finance. What is it called? The new
monetary theory.
New monetary theory. So there are some really left field economists who and politicians in the US, for example, says that if central bank can print money to support banks, why can't it print money to spend on infrastructure? But the two are very different, because infrastructure, you actually have got to mobilize manpower and material resources. So the inflationary impact is going to be very, very different. So I'm also very worried that in a post-crisis world, there is a temptation not to have a large fiscal stimulus without actually properly pricing in cost recovery and financing infrastructure properly. But between the two, I'm actually more worried about economic nationalism, you have to say. So I hope that the post-crisis infrastructure stimuli will be done in a rational, coordinated way. I hope that answers your question, Kevin.
Okay, well, we are out of time. We did miss two, one from Michaela and one from Rashid. So I will send those to you, JP, and hopefully you can follow up with them directly after on those questions. So let me please thank JP and your team, Martin, everyone for your presentation. Really, really deep content, very interesting. There was a mention of the AIB blog. If you would like to read any of the blogs being written and posted, please check AIB's website. And if you yourself would be interested in posting a blog, anyone listening, please reach out to the communications team in particular. And let me thank the people who pulled this together, even though I got thanked. All I did was show up today, quite honestly. So thank you to Ashley, Lindsay, and Lynn, who did pull together today's AI brief. And I wish everybody a wonderful weekend. It's beautiful weather here in Beijing. Hopefully it's beautiful where everybody is too. So take care and thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.